podcast is part of the Sports Social Podcast Network.
Hello and welcome to the Ground Jewels. My name is James Dixon and I'm delighted that you've joined us for our first podcast of 2025. I hope Christmas and New Year treated you well. You either had the eventful time that you wanted or a nice restful, peaceful time. Today's episode is fabulous. We've got a brilliant guest. We have Phil McGowan. He is the curator of the World Rugby Museum, which is based at Twickenham in London. And he is so knowledgeable about World Rugby, as you'd expect as the curator of the World Rugby Museum, but also about Twickenham itself and the ground and the role that it plays within rugby, etc., etc. I didn't get into the Allianz Stadium Twickenham naming debate very much with him. I call it Twickenham throughout, I think, the interview, because it's not really his role, and we've talked about it before, and we all know the deal with sort of stadium naming rights. People pay for them, broadcasters have to use them, but we can choose the names that we want to use, so that's fine by me. And yeah, it's a really interesting interview, and I won't delay us too much from getting to there, but there is some really interesting news sort of around the grounds, our regular segment where we look at stadium news. And there's a few things I want to bring to you this week. And firstly is news from Bristol and Bristol Women's Rugby. And they've pulled off the coup of sort of the off-season. And they sign Ilona Mayer, the American women's sevens bronze medalist from the Olympics and Dancing with the Stars runner-up as well. Huge name on social media, on TikTok and Instagram. And because they signed Ilona Mayer, Bristol had to move the game to Ashton Gate and more than doubled their previous record attendance, almost having 10,000 fans turn out to see her for a women's premiership match. So that's amazing. And that's a kind of another sort of sign of the growth of women's rugby, which we do talk about in this episode with Phil, because Twickenham is going to be hosting the Women's Rugby World Cup final in 2025 when England hosts that tournament. And thinking ahead to the Rugby World Cup of 2027, there's a lot of rumblings coming out of Australia that Melbourne is going to be entirely cut out of the 2027 Rugby World Cup bid. There is bad blood between Rugby Australia, which is the governing body, which is mostly based in Sydney, but Sydney, Queensland as sort of the traditional strongholds of rugby union in Australia. And they got rid of the Melbourne Super Rugby franchise. There's been acrimony about mismanagement or bad faith. I don't really fully know all the details, but apparently the Victorian government might not be supporting the bid in the way that Rugby Australia wanted them to do, but it's normally financial, isn't it, if things like this happen. And yeah, kind of expected the final to go to Sydney anyway because of the history there. It hosted the 2003 Rugby World Cup final when England won. But for no stadia in Melbourne to host anything would be a big step. Although, when Australia did last host in 2003, they did cut an entire country out of the Rugby World Cup bid at late notice, because that was supposed to be a tournament co-hosted with New Zealand until Rugby Australia saw a potential political move and took advantage of it. So if that does happen, if that comes to pass, these sort of briefings and leaks, that will be really interesting. And it's as good a time as any to plug the archive, because the last episode of 2024 is the more normal way of saying it, isn't it? Was on the Melbourne Cricket Ground with the brilliant Jared Kimber. And we talk about that city's sporting and cultural identity and which is cricket, which is VFL, AFL, which is a little bit sort of rugby league and basketball and other things like that. So if you do want to know more about Melbourne, and we've had such great feedback on that episode. I mean, the analytics on it have just gone through the roof. So I know people like that episode. So dive back into the archive, listen to Jared's episode if you haven't already. And the final bit of stadium news also gives me a chance to plug something else from way back in the archive when we spoke to our friend Chris Law about Beaver Stadium, the home of the Penn State Nittany Lions. And there is a fantastic video. If you love demolition videos on the internet, there's a brilliant video of their west stand with the huge press box coming down because they're undergoing a big renovation. And it's an exciting time to be a Penn State fan because they're in the semi-finals of the college football playoff. They're playing Notre Dame in a few days' time, and that will be, a big chance for Penn State to get to win a college national title for the first time in a long, long time. And so if you do like your college football or your NFL, or just interested in sort of, student athletics in America, do check out the Chris Law Beaver Stadium episode in our archive. It's a really good one as well. And finally, Everton have announced test events for their new stadium at Bramley-Moore Dock. So there's going to be an event with up to 10,000 in attendance, then they're going to double it. So as we're nearing the end for Goodison Park, which is sad in many ways, we're starting to see the new replacement stadium come online, and that'll be interesting to keep an eye on. But this is a rugby-themed episode, so we should get back to the rugby, and let's hear from the wonderful Phil McGowan. So today we're joined by Phil McGowan, the curator of the World Rugby Museum, and a man who has literally written the book on the stadium we're going to discuss. Phil, welcome to the Ground Jewels.
How are you doing, James?
I'm really good, and I'm picking up a slight Lancastrian accent, so we're obviously going to discuss Twickenham, home of English Rugby Union.
Yeah, that's right. So I was born in Rochdale and raised there. But yeah, I've been an employee at Twickenham Stadium now for 17 years.
Oh, wow, you must have seen a lot in that time, a lot of change as well.
Yeah, it changes all the time. I've spent most of my time in the World Rugby Museum, in the library, and buried in books and things and learning about the history of the place, but also been involved in some of the development work that's taken place in that time to make sure that history is well represented around Allianz Stadium, as it's now known.
Yeah, now this is the sort of latest development. We're speaking in the November Autumn Internationals. We're speaking at the end of November 2024. England have just played 3 exciting but unsuccessful games, and the first 3 games that they've played at the new Allianz Stadium. How's that going down?
My tour guides are finding it quite difficult to get used to. It's been Twickenham Stadium for a long time, and we've been talking about that for many years. But there you go, that's changed. It's bringing in a great deal of additional revenue to the RFU, which they can then invest in grassroots game. And everybody's in favour of that. So that's progress.
There we go. So why? Because when I reached out to you, I wasn't sure what you'd pick, because obviously people have fond attachments to their club grounds. People, even the sort of, like you say, back to where you've played sort of grassroots rugby. But you were emphatic. You said it has to be Twickenham. So why is Twickenham your ground jewel?
So I think it would be profoundly disloyal for me to pick anywhere other than the place that I've lived and worked for the last 17 years. I do have attachments to other stadiums. Stadiums are very personal things. I think they're one of the few places that bring different generations together. So I, as a boy, would stand on the terraces at Roker Park in Sunderland in the knowledge that my grandfather, great-grandfather and great-great-grandfather all stood there as well. And that means a lot to you when you're growing up. And then there are other stadiums as well. There's Spotland Road in Rochdale, which I went to and continue to go to many times. There's other rugby grounds. But yeah, when you work in a place for as long as I have, you get the opportunity to really find out all the secret nooks and crannies and learn about what makes a place special. And Twickenham Stadium really is special.
It is, and I have a similar sort of sentimental attachment to Trent Bridge, having worked there just after university and on the catering side, and walking around the stadium when it's empty and being able to go into the bowels of the different stands and all that sort of stuff. So I fully appreciate where you're going with there. Let's take this in a slightly direction that you weren't maybe expecting this to start with, because you mentioned Scotland there. And you also mentioned being involved in the development of the ground to make sure that of Twickenham, to make sure that there's nice touches and nods to history. I think one of my favourite things in any ground, certainly British ground, is the Cloughy statue at Rochdale in Scotland. For people who don't, it's such a nice touch. The club have honoured like a long time loyal fan who's passed away and is no longer with us, and his statue sits in the ground there. I mean, from your sort of professional hat, as well as sort of the heart, part of you that remains on the terraces in Scotland there, you must appreciate that.
I think it's really nice to pay tribute to a fan, because stadiums wouldn't be what they are without the fans. And, we often remember the performances on the field, but without the crowd generating the atmosphere, then, they wouldn't be the same place. And talking about Trent Bridge, you've probably noticed yourself that stadiums are almost two different places. On a match day, they're full of life and colour and noise and activity. But when they're empty, when they're not in use for matches, they're almost cathedral-like and very quiet and very serene and very different places.
I love it. I love being in an empty stadium. It's something, it feels, is naughty the right word? It certainly feels special. You certainly feel privileged, and it feels like I feel a little bit naughty, like you're somewhere where you shouldn't be. Now, I guess maybe that feeling fades after working in a place for 17 years. But yeah, there is something about the potential of a stadium, because it is, like you say, it's nothing until the teams arrive, and as we saw with COVID, really, it's nothing. The teams are one thing, but it's nothing until the fans arrive as well.
Yeah, I think when you've got a building that's geared up for 80,000 people and you're the only one there, that makes you feel quite important, doesn't it? So yeah, you just have little pinch me moments every now and then when you walk around.
That must be nice. So let's go to that then. Let's go to the 82,000. Although I've recently read and we've heard that there might be a slight capacity reduction to improve the fan experience. I don't know euphemistically what that means, but the press release said to improve the fan experience. But Twickenham is the largest dedicated rugby union ground in the world, and we know it's done other things. It's done little bits of NFL and rugby league, and it's had concerts there and whatnot. But as rugby union goes, this is the biggest. What is Twickenham like on a full match day? So a big final, a Six Nations game, an autumn international. For someone who's not had the privilege, what is that match day experience like at Twickenham, and how might it differ to other big stadiums?
So one of the things that really separates rugby union from other sports, particularly team sports, is that there's no segregation of fans. So if you come to Twickenham for an England versus Scotland or an England versus France game, you might well find yourself sitting next to a Scot or a Frenchman, and inevitably you will enjoy their company, win or lose. And that really, in a way, takes the pressure off the result, and it makes it more of an occasion. And I think it's one of the things that has fans coming back for more, because they just enjoy the camaraderie, the spirit that exists off the pitch amongst fans. And it's always been a feature of the game. So there's a famous quote about rugby union being a game of three halves: the first half, the second half, and the third half, which is when you make merry and you enjoy each other's company and maybe have a few drinks. And that half is as important as the other two. And that's something that is true of rugby union within local clubs and around the country, around the world, and it's true at international level as well. And I think, that's something that people really enjoy.
Yeah, I agree. Although you don't have to wait until after the game to make merry. Sometimes the third half can be the first half, right?
Yes, well, if you're not playing, I guess you can make merry all day, and people certainly do when they come here. But you get people singing. You might get a few bagpipes depending on who the opposition is. But if the Argentinians are in town, you'll get a lot of singing, a lot of chanting. And for me personally, I'm usually in work on a match day, so I'm in the museum, and out the side of my window, I'll have all of this activity going on, and you'll just see the day builds as it gets closer to kick off. More and more people appear, more and more stands selling food. And then by the time you get to about an hour before kickoff, it's like a sea of people just heading towards the gates, getting ready to take their seats to enjoy the national anthems, maybe the haka, and all of that pre-match theatre that goes on before the game even begins.
Yeah, I do like that. It's one of the abiding sort of features for Twickenham for me is really how much the match day experience spreads beyond the ground itself. It's really, it's from the train station, it can even be from Richmond. I used to live in Acton, and sometimes I wouldn't even bother trying to get as far as Twickenham because the connections didn't work that well. The trains were rammed, and I'd walk from Richmond over for match days. But there's so many rugby themed pubs, the Cabbage Patch, you've got people selling. If there's a front garden that's got a bit of space in, someone will set up a food stand or some sort of unofficial concession there. And it's just, and then you've got the Twickenham car park, which has sort of, it's probably the closest we get in British sport to like the American experience of tailgating.
Yeah, the West Car Park, it has a history of its own. So we have pictures in our collection of the West Car Park in the 1920s, absolutely full of Rolls Royces and Bentleys and wonderful cars with little picnic tables set up out the front with caviar, champagne, food and drink, and lots of people dressed up to the nines and enjoying each other's company. And Twickenham,
not to play to stereotypes or anything there.
well, in the 1920s, that's what you would find if you came to Twickenham. So it was part of the scene, it was something that people did along with Royal Ascot and Wimbledon, and they'd come and enjoy each other's company. They might do a bit of networking. They'd probably watch the game at some point, but it was as much a social occasion as it was a sporting occasion, and people still do that. That probably created the blueprint for corporate hospitality, which we've had here since the early 1980s, but now is really, really central to what goes on at Twickenham. Corporate hospitality is the RFU's biggest revenue driver. So English rugby raises more money that way than it does through ticket sales, sponsorship, broadcasting rights, anything at all. And that's probably unique among sports. And that was begun with the West Car Park, and it was an organic, natural thing that emerged that was then developed more modernly in more modern times.
Yeah, and I suppose it's interesting and the framing of that as a big revenue raiser for the RFU and the sort of and indirectly there for the grassroots game. It's kind of important from your perspective because a lot of people see the corporate hospitality in rugby, sometimes the ticket prices, and they draw sort of negative inferences from that, and they'll make contrasts with the costs of other sport and different things like that. And there can be a bit of negative stereotyping of rugby union fans, particularly at Twickenham, which I'm guessing from the way that you frame that you think is possibly unfair.
Well, everybody's able to make their own interpretation of that situation. It's very difficult to get tickets for Six Nation matches full stop unless you're a member of a rugby club. So price isn't necessarily the big factor there. Scotland, Wales, Ireland, all of those tickets go to the clubs. They don't go on general sale. But then there are other matches that are a lot cheaper and do go into general sale. The Red Roses, for example, you can get a ticket for £5. For the summer internationals, you can often get a ticket for £40. So there are lots of opportunities for people to come and see England at Twickenham. But yeah, there is a premium market as well. And the thing to remember there is as we've said, that the revenue raised does go to investment into the game.
Yeah. One of the things which is unique to Twickenham as well, while we're sort of focusing on sort of atmosphere a match day. And I was sort of interested in my research to find that you had a role in sort of debunking the the origin story as it had been told to me was Swing Low Sweet Chariot. So for a long time, if listeners don't know, it had become associated with the England team. And it was sort of attributed to a winger called Chris Oatey, who had a phenomenal game once, I think in 1988. But you found out that that wasn't the first time that it was sung at Twickenham.
Somebody told me actually. So
Oh, okay.
what happened?
Yes.
So this was a few years ago. I was getting the trophy ready for the England Ireland match, which was the Millennium Trophy, which was on display in the museum. And somebody observed me doing that in the museum, and we got into a conversation about that match when Chris Oatey scored his tries. And that person said that they remembered singing Swing Low for Martin Afire at Twickenham around about the same time, which I didn't think too much of at the time, but then it occurred to me that Martin Afire was primarily a rugby league player. And I found out that he'd played in the Middlesex Sevens in 1987 for Roslyn Park Seconds and reached the final, which was a year before the England-Ireland match. So I learnt that and just kept it in the back of my mind for a little while before having a bit of spare time and realising that there might be something to dig into there. So I went to the BBC archive and they found me the rugby special tapes that covered the Middlesex Sevens from 1987. And throughout that commentary, whenever Rosalind Park are on the field, you can hear Swing Low Sweet Chariot being sung from the stands. The commentators mention it, the great waves of song coming down. And that was, to my knowledge, the first time that song was sung at Twickenham. And the fact that the person who recalled that, because he was there, recalled it being sung for Martin Afire, then was another clue in that his nickname was Chariots, for Chariots of Fire. So it's not a hard and solid theory. These historical theories never are, and somebody might come up with a better theory at some point in the future, but that pushes the story back a little bit further. And we thought that was worth reporting on, and the BBC picked it up and reported it too.
Absolutely, it was one of those. It's one of those. It's become so important to the England team, much the same way as Fields of Athenry is to Ireland, or Hymns and Arias is to Wales. That having a correct and even if it's not definitive, but a more accurate sort of social history of that is important. It's still amazing that we've the song is associated with the English, given the origins of it, is associated with English rugby, but the world sort of moves in mysterious ways, doesn't it?
Yeah, I agree. I mean, the song itself is a very personal song for the Black American community who sing it at funerals. So for them to then learn that it was sung at English rugby matches was probably quite shocking. So if we've helped to explain to that community why and its origins, because it was sung in folk clubs in the 1960s, and rugby clubs were often folk clubs. They would have live music events. So there was crossover, and the rugby members got to know the song and sung it at rugby clubs from that period onwards. But ultimately, crowds do what they want. And if they decide that they want to sing that song, then that's what they'll do.
And it's wit and wisdom of crowds. We talk about it so often. You can the humour that you find in crowds, and that comes from if you don't get the the film, the Nigel Havers Chariots of Fire film in the early 80s, and you don't get Martin Afire coming through Roslyn Park at that point, with the nickname of Chariots of Fire, then you don't get this opportunity to have this moment, which has then gone and had such a profound impact on sort of the match day experience for 80,000 people every time England turn out at Twickenham. It's a wonderful sort of quirk of history, and it's these sort of curiosities which makes me sometimes feel like we're living in a simulation. But yeah, it's you certainly couldn't have planned it. You wouldn't have foreseen it in the 1860s. I'm sure. I suppose it's worthwhile talking about why Twickenham exists, really, because we talked about the importance it is to you, the number of years you've worked for the RFU, how important it is to English rugby. But it's not always been there, even though it probably it's now over 100 years old. It feels like it's been part of the furniture for a long time. But international rugby's over 150 years old, and up until 1910, England had a pretty nomadic existence.
Yeah, that's right. So in the 19th century, England played at multiple different grounds. The first match was at Raeburn Place in Edinburgh. That's where Scotland were playing. First home match, 1872, was at the Oval in London. But by the 1880s, 1890s, they were playing in places like Headingley in Leeds, Meanwood Park in Leeds, Fallowfield in Manchester, Crown Flat in Dewsbury, Rectory Field, of course, at Blackheath, where they played regularly. So yeah, they were travelling around the country, and often they were actually playing in the north because in the 1880s, that's effectively where the heartlands of rugby union lay. So that's where they would get the biggest crowds and the most engagement.
And so I guess what happens then is in the George Hotel in Huddersfield in 1895 and the formation of the Northern Rugby Football Union.
Exactly. So with so much in rugby history, that's the pivotal date. So in 1895, so 22 clubs defected from the Rugby Football Union and set up the Northern Rugby Football Union, which later became Rugby League. And the immediate effect of that on the England team, or at least over the following 2 years, was to basically deprive England of most of their best players because that region had become dominant. Look, Yorkshire and Lancashire were the two sides that regularly contested the county championship final, which drew in the biggest crowds. And so when all of those players left, England were diminished significantly. So to give you some stats to support that, England won the championship in 1892 very successfully without conceding a single point. They wouldn't win it again for the following 18 years. They didn't beat Wales from 1898 to 1910. And regularly in the 1900s, they finished bottom of the championship table with the wooden spoon, often having not won any of their fixtures. So probably the biggest low point that English rugby's ever been through, and directly attributable to the split that happened in 1895. And obviously this opened up the administrators for criticism. The press were asking what they were going to do about this, how they were going to resurrect the fortunes of the national side. And their solution was to build a national stadium. So in 1907, the RFU purchased 3 plots of land in Twickenham, or on the borders of Twickenham and Isleworth, where they built a stadium, which it opened in 1909 with a Harlequins Richmond match, and then in 1910 when it hosted its first international match, England versus Wales. And as I mentioned, England hadn't beaten Wales for a long time, but they scored a try after 30 seconds in that match. They went on to win that game, and they went on to win the championship for the first time since 1892. So this solution that the RFU had come up with was immediately successful, and England were restored. And from that period onwards, England had a very strong period. I think Wales didn't win here until 1926. England won a championship in 1910, the Grand Slam in 1913, again in 1914, and then continued that level of success throughout the 1920s as well.
Sorry, my cat is banging at the cat flap. I've got to throw him out. Do apologise. I'm going to have to edit that. Sorry about that. That's not conducive for recording. Let me just make an edit point here, which is all really fascinating. But why was Twickenham? Do you have any insight into why Twickenham was chosen? I mean, London obviously makes sort of sense, I guess, if you're going to have a national stadium, certainly at that time. But is there any particular thinking or knowledge of why Twickenham was chosen?
So the best assumption is that the land was cheap. Yeah. So they looked at Wembley, they looked at Stamford Bridge, both homes of big stadiums today, and they were both too expensive. So they looked slightly outside of the borders of London. At that time, London hadn't sprawled as far as Twickenham. And Billy Williams knew of a plot of land. His uncle actually farmed the plot adjacent to it, so may have turned him onto it. And it was in Twickenham. It was unsuitable in many respects. It wasn't that close to the train station. It still isn't. The press complained that it was too far from Piccadilly Circus, and lots of people said that this is agrarian land. It's used for farming, not for sports. And for quite a few years after that, the press complained that the grass was too long and was therefore unsuitable for rugby, as they do. But as we know, the stadium has since established itself as a very, very suitable place to play international sport.
Oh yeah, I mean the grass isn't too long there now. So is that where the sort of cabbage patch nickname comes from? Was it sort of a little bit derisory to start with?
Yeah, 100%. So yeah, the cabbage patch nickname came up because it was a land that was used for growing fruits, apples, green gages, things like that. Not cabbages, but that was chosen obviously as a way to lob more bombs at the RFU.
You know, and it's as with all of these things, the best thing to do is to take that and own it, and spin it around on the people slinging that as an insult, and almost and many years later, it's there's a famous pub now called the Cabbage Patch, not too far from the station. So I suppose from there, so what's your sort of personal story with Twickenham? Do you remember the first time that you either saw a game there? Because it would have been on grandstand all the time. Certainly when I was growing up, you'd get 2 games a year, and then if anyone was touring, there'd be a Twickenham game as well. I saw it quite a lot on telly when growing up. But do you remember the first time when you saw it, and how long from then until you made your first visit?
Yeah, you mentioned grandstand, and I am exactly that generation. So we talked earlier about how I grew up in Rochdale, which is a rugby league town. So I played all sports, but I more often played rugby league in the evening on the school field out the back of my house. But my school did have a rugby union team as well. But my first exposure to rugby union was on a Saturday afternoon on grandstand, and I watched it, and I watched all sports: tennis, hockey, football, golf, darts. On that program, and really enjoyed all of them, and became a bit of a stato when it came to following these sports. A big fan of sumo wrestling now, so I'm still expanding my repertoire when it comes to new sports. Wow. But for me, it was that it was the Five Nations then, and I was still in high school just about when the 1991 Rugby World Cup happened, and there was a big push to get more young people interested in rugby union for that tournament, and I was definitely one of the people that fell into that bracket, and followed that one religiously, and was very disappointed when England fell at the final hurdle, which seemed to happen a lot for English sports teams in that period. And thereafter, I was rugby union was one of the sports that I kept tabs on and made my lists of who won what when, and who were the captains, and how many points were scored, and so on.
Yeah, it was a sort of devastating time for English fandom, the early 90s, with World Cup semi-final in 1990, the 12-6 game at Twickenham for the Rugby World Cup. Of course, a few months later, England would lose the Cricket World Cup in heartbreaking fashion as well to Imran Khan's Pakistan. It wasn't the best time to be a fan of the national team. So yeah, and I'm from that. I'm a little bit younger, but yeah, I'm still getting, still before the Sky dominance and coming in, a sort of fragmentation of media, and still getting a lot of stuff. I think the first time I remember seeing Twickenham was when New Zealand were touring in 1993, and England, thanks to John Callard, who seemed preposterously muscular and large to be a fullback. But we had a phenomenal boot on him, kicked 5 penalties, and we beat the All Blacks that day. And I was just like, oh, fine. And then everyone was acting like it was the strangest thing ever that England had managed to beat the All Blacks, because we'd obviously had a few years where they'd certainly been the betters of us. But yeah, I can totally see that. Do you remember then when you re-engage with rugby union? And sort of what came first, sort of the personal sort of fandom, or did work take you there?
I don't think I ever stopped engaging with rugby. England
That's
were a
fair.
good team in the 90s, so
Mm.
they had obviously the Will Carling period up to 95, 96, and that was immediately followed by the team that would then go on to win the World Cup in 2003.
Mm.
And we talked about England failing at the final hurdle. That was the team that finally got the job done. And I don't know that those players really appreciate what that meant to English sports fans, just to
Oh, it's
finally
huge.
demonstrate to all of us that we could be world champions and that we could be the best. And that's a real, that has a personal effect on young people as well, to know that their team can be number one. So yeah, I was celebrated wildly that one. I was living in Japan at the time when that happened,
Oh
so I
wow.
watched it with several Australian friends. I even watched the Great Britain hockey team win the gold medal in 1988 because we were so starved of success in those years. So I remember that one very fondly as well. Sean Curley, and his teammates. So
Mm.
yeah, I was getting. I'm a mad sports fan, so I devour sports content wherever it is. So I never stopped following rugby union. The opportunity to work here came after I'd finished my master's degree in museums and heritage studies, and I'd worked in a few other museums. My other passion is history, so I've got a bit of an encyclopedic knowledge of history as well, not just sports history, but all sorts of history. But the opportunity to merge those two passions and come and work here at the museum at Twickenham was too good to turn down, and it's kept me here ever since.
Yeah, I think you've got my ideal job. It's it's I'm very envious of the fusion between fusion between sports and history. I think the 2003 Rugby World Cup team do not get enough credit. You're completely right, because I'm not sure that the 2005 Ashes win happens if we don't have this win the rugby in the way that we do in Australia in 2003. Certainly gave the nation a lot more confidence. And I think there's something to do with the football team as well. At the time, were playing a bit better. They'd just beaten um, Germany 5-1 in Munich. There was all this sort of, I don't know, things bubbling up, but the rugby were at the vanguard of that. And from the 90, you'll know this, but from the 1999 World Cup group game against New Zealand, which England lost, and we ended up getting knocked out of that tournament in Paris in the quarterfinals. But from then, England don't lose at Twickenham until after they win the 2003 Rugby World Cup, and it really became a fortress. And that period, to me, of English dominance at Twickenham, particularly, was was really invigorating. And in my mind, it sort of starts with the Ian Bolshaw kick and the Dan Luger sort of last minute try against Australia. We come from behind against the world champions, and yeah, we just never looked like losing at Twickenham during that era.
Yeah, I agree. I think the Dan Luger try is the one that stands out for me. It just because England played really well in that match, but were just a little bit behind at the end, but then got probably
Mm-hmm.
what they deserved with that score. And I watched that on TV, but the reaction of the fans to see it all come together just gave that team so much confidence and belief that they could beat the best and that potentially they were the best. And they went and proved that over the following 2 or 3 years. Probably 2002 was their best year, winning
Mm.
away in New Zealand with 13 men. I think once they'd achieved things like that, winning the World Cup was a formality, really, but they still had to go and do it. And by 2003, they were probably just over their peak as well.
Yeah,
So it
definitely.
it could have slipped away from them. And sometimes sports teams win World Cups and World Championships without being the out and out best team. It just becomes more of a lottery. But often with rugby union, there's a team that demonstrates that they're a little bit better than the others. And and Ireland were in that position recently, but didn't get it done. But England did get it done, and I think that was psychologically incredibly important for them, but also for English sports teams in general, like you say.
Yeah. I don't know if you know this, but I wrote a book on the Rugby World Cup relatively recently, and the game in, I think it's Wellington, maybe it's Carisbrooke. I can't. But the 13-man game is the only game that I selected because I picked 15 different games to tell the story of the Rugby World Cup, and that was the only one that didn't actually take place in a Rugby World Cup, which I chose because I just think it's so important that that giving the England the confidence to win away, because we at that time, while Twickenham was the fortress, we'd gone to Murrayfield and lost a Grand Slam in a Grand Slam decided. We'd gone to Lansdowne Road and we'd lost in Paris, and it's that ability to take that home form, and that from Twickenham, and take it on the road, which made them the unbeatable side that they became.
Yeah, and that was, I would say, Lewis Moody's best match for England, who wasn't even getting in the starting 15. He was, this is how strong that team were. So he was the second choice back row, but the second choice was phenomenal too. And I think Clive Woodward demonstrated it being a 23-man game. Lewis Moody actually won the line out, which set up Johnny Wilkinson's drop goal in the final. So players that weren't starting the match were some of the most important players at the end of the match. And the attention to detail that Clive Woodward introduced, I think, the preparation, the being in different situations during a game and finding a way to win, which he rehearsed and drilled into his players. I think all of that came together alongside having some of the best players that England have ever had, like Jason Robinson, Martin Johnson, Lawrence Dallaglio. Really, really special time for English rugby. And it's just a shame that we're still talking about it so much now, and we haven't quite got up to those levels since, but we've been close.
We have been very close. I mean, I allowed myself to dream in 2019. I think we all did for a week particularly after the semi-final, and we all possibly underestimated what was coming our way in the Springboks. I remember the Telegraph, and this is not to pick on the Telegraph because it's got really good sports writers, but every single of their rugby writers and analysts and sort of celebrity or commentators or whoever it was, all 12 of them picked England, and only one of them had it within one score. It was just that we all got sort of sucked up in a little bit of English hubris, maybe.
It's always a danger sign when the commentators are all united in their predictions. Something's going to go wrong. I remember 2012 when the All Blacks were in town to play England, and not a single one thought England would win. Jeremy Guscott, I remember, said it's just a matter of how many they lose by. And that just made me think, something's going to happen here. There's too much hubris about, and that opens the door. And that happens a lot in sport, happens a lot in rugby. We were talking about that maybe with some of this weekend's fixtures as well, but we'll wait and see.
Well, is this you? I mean, this is obviously going to go out after that, but is you confidently predicting a win for Japan then at Twickenham, or is it another game that you've got your own?
I was more thinking of the Wales match, but I would love to see Japan win at Twickenham, although obviously it wouldn't please my colleagues. But I do have a soft spot for Japan, having lived there for a few years, and they're a very interesting and exciting team. So it's great to see them progress and develop.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I mean, I still remember where I was. I wish I was at the Get Back when they beat South Africa in Brighton. It was. But it's still probably the best upset in sporting history. And this is the thing with stadiums. You can go to a theatre play, you can go to an opera, you can go to a ballet, you can go to whatever. You're going to see high quality performance. You're going to see people who are the best at the world at what they're doing, but you know what's going to happen. The beauty of sport in the theatre of sport is that you're going to see the best people in the world at doing what they do. And no one knows what's going to happen, even if everyone thinks they know what's going to happen. And in rugby, more so than football and more so than cricket, the favourites usually win. That 10%, 5% chance that they might not win is what keeps you coming back every time and time again.
Yeah, and Japan are very much the flag bearers for that kind of unpredictability. They've had some incredible wins over the last 10, 12 years. Never beaten England, but they've run England close in the 1970s when England perhaps didn't take them as seriously as they ought to have done. And their brand of fast attacking rugby can trouble any team on their day. So yeah, let's see what happens.
Yeah, it should be good. And I love the teams that have got their own sort of philosophies. And it helps when you sort of develop a little bit in isolation from some of the centres of the world game, where you realise, well, we can't go and match South Africa for their style, and we can't maybe match New Zealand for their style. So we've got to create something of our own. And I think Japan and Argentina, to a certain extent, have both done that. And they've taken bits of inspiration from around the world game, but they've kept their own identity. And one of my favourite games at the most recent World Cup in France, I was very lucky to be in Nantes at the stadium there. God, I forget the name of it. It was the football stadium, but it's fine. And I was at the Argentina-Japan game, which was effectively a knockout game because they'd both lost to England in the pool, and two completely different fan cultures, two completely different rugby cultures. But what a game it was, and what an atmosphere they were able to create. And I think the more that, and maybe this fits in with your remit for the World Rugby Museum, the more that rugby can develop beyond, the traditional Anglo-centric model of rugby as it developed through maybe its first 100 years, with the notable exception of France, obviously. I think the better for the game.
Yeah, I agree. One of the rooms in our museum is called Sport of Empire in the World, which charts how the game arrived in the various rugby playing nations. And it's all to do with that 19th century imperial trading network. So obviously Japan and Argentina weren't part of the British Empire, but they were really significant ports, for trade ports for imperial ships. And if you look at the big teams, it's usually ports that they derived out of. So it's part of the history of the game. It's one of the things that perhaps, rugby suffers from compared to other sports, because, we don't have India or Pakistan in rugby, whereas cricket has that huge opportunity and a huge market there. Football obviously reaches almost every country in the world, whereas rugby still has its core. But it would be great to see it develop beyond those confines at some point.
Yeah, I guess a couple of the things that have really been helping the development of the game recently have been the introduction of sevens to the Olympic program and the really strong development of women's rugby. And we've got the Women's Rugby World Cup in all across England next year, 2025, and the final. Is it already sold out at Twickenham? Have they already sold out Twickenham, or are they trying to sell it? But the final's going to be at Twickenham, and you're certainly hoping for a sellout, aren't we?
Yeah, definitely. So I don't think all of the tickets are sold, but I think they sold 200,000 tickets in fairly short order, for not just for the final, but for some of the other games as well. But the ambition is to sell out Twickenham for the first time, which will be another milestone in what is a very rapid development period for women's rugby. And I hope we do it. The women's matches at Twickenham are some of the best for atmosphere. It's a really, really positive atmosphere. We had just under 60,000 here a couple of years ago, and that was the first ever standalone women's fixture at Twickenham, which was really important, and hopefully has laid the foundations for next year and beyond. But the women have played here before that. They played their first game here in 2003, but it was always either before or after a men's match in front of a few hundred people. So it didn't really just do justice to the quality of the play in the teams. But that's changed now, and women's rugby is one of the fastest growing sports in the world. And it's the real huge growth area for rugby generally, because other parts of the game aren't growing fast or are shrinking. But the women's game is expanding rapidly in all directions, which is brilliant to see.
Yeah, I mean, some of the games in the last Women's World Cup, which was in New Zealand, I think delayed for a year by COVID. But some of the quality of play, I mean, England obviously were unlucky. Amazing sort of final against New Zealand. The French team in that tournament were incredibly competitive. I'm taking my daughter. It's going to be her first big rugby union game. 2 games actually, because you get the third place playoff as well. And I'm just so excited for the potential. And it's what you said at the beginning, really. It's just like, it's also giving more people opportunities to access Twickenham. And if they did, for whatever reason, feel priced out for, if they were priced out for some of the bigger games, or didn't have long-standing relationships with your local rugby club, or whatever that is, I think it was 10 quid. It might have been 15 quid, but it was certainly very reasonable. For a World Cup final, when you're going to get the 2 best teams in the world, that's incredible value, and I can't imagine it won't be a sellout.
Sorry, I lost you there for a second. Yeah, I heard everything you said, but yeah,
I thought it was a good point anyway. So.
Yeah, it's going to be, as I said, it's a fantastic atmosphere for the women's rugby, and some of our volunteers actually only go to the women's matches now because it's a less alcohol-based experience. So there's a lot more singing, there's a lot more activity around the stadium that's not just being in the bar. I mean, there's nothing wrong with going to the bar. Some people prefer that, but it's an option.
Some people prefer going to the bar to watching the game. I've noticed. It's fun.
Yeah. But yeah, it's a great experience. And the good thing about the tournament is, for a long time, it's been a bit of a 2-horse race. It's been England and New Zealand that will generally contest the final, apart from the first 2 editions where USA was strong as well. But that has now changed, and you've now got at least 4 teams that can beat each other. So England, New Zealand, Canada and France. And you've got the USA and Ireland improving rapidly as well, so that the overall quality of the tournament is about to change significantly, and it will just make it a better product.
Yeah, I was going to say Ireland I feel are the coming force there. The way that they're how serious the development they've gone from the 3rd division of WXV to the 1st division in such a rapid time. I think they're going to be definitely the ones to watch. I'm going to give you a couple of subjects to end our chat on, because I think it's been a lovely chat, by the way, and thank you for the time that you've given to the podcast. One would be, and you can either take one or both or neither, really. You can hang up at any time. I appreciate that. But what would you say to someone who's never been to the World Rugby Museum, and encourage them to either come as a standalone visit or make it as part of their sort of a reason to make it part of their sort of Twickenham match day experience, whether for the Women's World Cup or somewhere else? And what are some of your other, we talked a lot about, one of the beauties of rugby, as you highlighted initially, is that third half, that camaraderie that you get with other supporters, whether they be club level or international level. What are some of the sort of features and quirks of other great stadiums around the world that sometimes you wish, I wish Twickenham had a little bit of that?
Right, so for the museum, so rugby's got a really fantastic history, and I think it's partly to do with the fact that it was an amateur sport for so long. So the characters that have played rugby over the years, for many of them, rugby is just a small footnote in their life, and then they went on to do the things that they're remembered for subsequent to that. So that allows our museum to talk about things like the armed forces, medicine, and all of the different professions that rugby players were involved in. So it's a much broader subject than just what happens on the field. Having said that, the highlights of our collection are things like the Calcutta Cup, which is the world's oldest international football trophy, a jersey from the very first international football match, which was a rugby match in 1871, an England jersey, the RFU's original minutes, and then objects from rugby school, where children invented the game of rugby football back in the 1840s. And it's vibrant, it's bright, it's loud. We make use of the anthems and the haka, so there's lots of music and noise. We don't want a quiet, bookish museum. We want it to be a lively space where you can go and really enjoy yourself. And we've got scrum machines, we've got kicking simulators, and the opportunity to test your own fitness and have a bit of fun as well. We're even giving away free drinks on match days as well, so there's another encouragement for everybody to come in. So that's the museum. If you're not here on a match day and you want to do the stadium tour as well, then Twickenham is full of iconic pieces of art and monuments to the past. So, for example, just to give one example, the Rose and Poppy Gate, which is the gate that the players walk through on a match day, was actually built in 1926 as a monument to George Rowland Hill, who was the secretary who kept rugby union and amateur sport. And when he died, the RFU built this gate in his honour. But that's its first name. Its second name was the Lion Gate. So a gold lion, was placed on top of it in 1970. There's a big history to that lion, which I won't go into because we'll be here all night. But so it was known as the Lion Gate for a long time, and then more recently it's been known as the Rose and Poppy Gate, because the physical gates that you walk through were installed or reinstalled in 2016, and it's made of metal. It has roses at the bottom that rise up to become poppies, and the poppies are made of metal, which are shell casements that were taken from the Somme battlefield from unexploded ordnance, and that's a war memorial to fallen rugby players. So when an England player walks through those gates on a match day, they're walking through a war memorial. So this represents the links between the current stadium, the players that have played there, and past generations, the armed forces for whom lots of rugby players served during the two wars, because they were all amateurs, they were able to enlist immediately. So all of these things are drawn together and represented somewhere in the stadium, in that case with the Rose and Poppy Gate. But that's just one of a number of monuments around the ground which serves to represent the rugby community as a whole. And as we develop the stadium further in the coming years, that's something that we'll hopefully develop on further.
Yeah, there's some fascinating stories from that time. Sorry to interject, but one of my favourites, it's hard to say favourites because it ends really tragically, but there's a story you'll probably know more than me of an England player called Douglas Lambert, who scored 5 tries against the French, one of the early games at Twickenham, I believe. I'm hoping that's right. A record that stood for a very long time. And you think, well, what happens to this? And he's, died 1915, as part of so many of that generation did. And it's just, their stories. And I think, if we can capture them and remember them in a place which they helped build and lionize and make people want to attend, I think that's so important. It's such an important job that you guys are doing.
Yeah, so Douglas Lambert's record still stands. 5 tries is still a record. It was Brilliant. 1909, so it's actually the year before Twickenham Open, in one of his first matches. I'll tell you another story on a similar theme. So his captain at Harlequins, Ronnie Poulton, was the captain of England in 1914 and won a Grand Slam. He scored 4 tries, I think, against France in the final match to win the Grand Slam. He then enlisted along with all of the other players in that team and was shot and killed by a sniper in 1915 in Belgium. He didn't die at once, and one of the things that he said before he passed away was he lamented that he would never play at Twickenham again. So in 2018, we took some of the soil to his grave and buried it there in Belgium, and brought some of the soil from his grave back to Twickenham and buried that pitch side. And that's just alongside the halfway line, at the side of the pitch, and it has his initials. So when the players take the field at Twickenham, they run past this memorial to Ronnie Poulton, just to remind the current generation what that previous generation did for them. Wow,
that's so powerful. Yeah, I mean, I'm ashamed that I didn't know that already, and that's brilliant. But obviously, these little touches, like when we, going back to like the Cloughy statue in Scotland, we have such opportunities with these places that are so important to so many people, for them not to be generic, for them to tell the story of that place and of the people who have made that place. And I think places that do that are to be commended.
Yeah, 100%. Stadiums are places of high drama, passion, happiness and sadness in equal measure. I don't think you can go to a place and experience that type of thing without it taking on some kind of spiritual quality. And so things that represent that, I think, are important to be just embedded in the fabric of the stadium. And that's what we try to do here.
Yeah, I think it's the best, where that sort of learning through osmosis, and if you're people aren't necessarily always going to seek out this sort of and be confronted with difficult subjects and difficult topics. But if it can be woven into the fabric of their experience, if they get 95% of what they get is brilliant sport, and they get one moment of reflection, I think that's absolutely fine as a balance, and it's really important societally and all that kind of thing, and it gets people coming back. And these play, and I suppose then maybe we'll swerve the question about other stadiums, but I guess then when you do these things like this, and as it emerged in recent years or recent months even, that the RFU considered, for perfectly understandable financial reasons, but from relocating from Twickenham, I guess this emotional and this sort of built connection between the generations who have played and spectated at Twickenham was one of the strong reasons why eventually they decided against that move.
Yeah, I mean, I still lament the fact that Roker Park's not there anymore, and I
Yeah,
think
true.
everybody does, don't they, if they've spent time at a sports stadium. But no, in terms of that process, I think it was incumbent on the RFU to consider all of the options, and that was one of them. And obviously, that would have been a very painful option to pursue, certainly for me and for lots of other people. But it doesn't look like that's the way we're going, which is good news in my opinion.
Yeah, well, I think on the balance of things, in my opinion too, it's one of the, it's an understandable gripe that England play very few matches outside of Twickenham, but it is a different financial model than cricket. It is a different financial model than football, and we're so lucky to have a stadium like Twickenham in our own country. And sure, if you're from the Midlands, it's a couple of hours drive. If you're from the north, it's worse. But we do have this asset, this intangible. Well, it's not intangible. It's very tangible. This cultural asset there that we wouldn't necessarily have if we had a different approach, and if the team had maintained its nomadic existence. You wouldn't be able to say, right, here's a place where we can go and take some soil from one of from Belgium and connect those generations through rugby. And I think it's it's really important, and I think you tell the story of Twickenham exceptionally well, Phil, and I can only thank you for joining us and sharing some of your experiences and memories with us.
You're very welcome. Thank you very much. And just on that last point that you make, I think it is really important that national stadiums reflect national regions, and perhaps that's something that Twickenham could do better, and might develop in the future, to have representation from all of the English regions somewhere included within the fabric, within the footprint of the stadium. So that might be something that we look to develop.
That'd be fantastic. You've got such strong rugby traditions in certain parts of the country. Southwest, East Midlands. There's something there for. If it was, it'd be fantastic. And I am ashamed to admit, and this, I told you, I'd never gone round the museum before, and I've even made it to the New Zealand Rugby Union Museum in Palmerston North in the North Island of New Zealand. But I will absolutely pop around this museum if on the Women's World Cup final day, if not before.
I look forward to seeing you then.
Thank you, Phil. Thank you for your time. I enjoyed that tremendously. When you speak to somebody who just knows so much about a subject, and I feel like he's so knowledgeable, and it's such a big stadium, important stadium, home of rugby, etc., etc., that we could have talked for another hour about something completely different. I just enjoyed it, and it's a big year for Twickenham. England have a chance in the Six Nations. They've got 3 home games this year. There's a Red Roses match between France and England at Twickenham in the Women's Six Nations. Obviously, the normal events like Army Navy, Gallagher Premiership final, going to be there, but building towards the Women's World Cup, as we discussed in the interview. I will be there. I'll be there with my daughter. Hopefully England will make it. On form, they should make it, but going into tournaments like this, that it only takes one bad performance. It might not even be your performance. We're expecting England and New Zealand to be sort of kept apart in the draw until the final. but only one of them needs to lose, and then they're meeting in the semi-finals. So who knows? Who knows? I'm excited for this year, and I think it's a great way to kick off the year on the Ground Jewels as well with that brilliant interview. We've got more coming up for you next week. Literally more coming up for you next week. We've got Ian Moore, the comedian. He's going to be talking about Carrow Road, although don't get too excited, Norwich fans. It's sort of how Carrow Road... Yeah, well, I'm not going to spoil it, but we're going to be talking a bit about Carrow Road and a lot about some other really interesting stadiums and topics as well from the world of sport. So, yeah, please join us next week, and if you do, I'll see you next time.
This podcast is part of the Sports Social Podcast Network.